Hey everyone, welcome back to the Essential NFL Podcast. I'm Stephen Clinton and rolling through division previews here on the Essential NFL Podcast. So anyone following along, much appreciated. Glad that the content's enjoyable for you as I get myself prepped for the upcoming NFL season here. Week 2's in the books, and reviewing all the teams across the league again in preparation for the upcoming season. So ran through a different variation of this exercise back in the spring. You can check out those written reports over at the Essential NFL Substack. In this version, looking to just update it based on kind of what's been happening since then. Tried to challenge some assumptions I might have made, and talk about expected win totals, my strength of schedule measures, and then some fantasy thoughts. So a quick programming note. Going to be doing a show Friday or Saturday. We'll kind of sort out what's going to work best with the rest of my obligations, watching film and pricing flash bet odds for NFL and NCAA. But get a show out Friday or Saturday that just kind of brings together all my thoughts from watching film across the league that week, and previewing the upcoming matchups, and take a forward look at it, obviously, because it'll be a little bit stale the past week of football at that point in the week. But I'll take everything I've gleaned from the film and spin it forward. So. Let's get to today and today's show. Looking at the AFC East, and going to run through it alphabetically, starting with the Buffalo Bills. So I'll just hit some high-level thoughts on each team, and then get into the fantasy thoughts I've got jotted down for this division, and then the season win total notes I've got. So the Buffalo Bills. I mean, I think it's a pretty good situation here, and I think that this is true of the Buffalo Bills and the Baltimore Ravens, who very well could have beaten the Buffalo Bills in the divisional round. Really competitive game, right? And I think that just like the Baltimore Ravens could have made it to the Super Bowl, were every bit as good as they needed to be as a football team in the NFL last year to go win a Super Bowl. It just didn't quite work out because they ran into another team that fit that description in the Buffalo Bills. And then the Buffalo Bills ran into a third team that fit that description in the Kansas City Chiefs. And, that's just been kind of the story over and over again in the AFC since Patrick Mahomes, entered the league. And, it's a tough mountain to climb at this point. And but at the same time, I think that the Bills and the Ravens, for that matter, are wise not to, go out and try to take some crazy swing or make some, headline-grabbing acquisition, because it's just so hard to say whether that really would put you over the top. Like, it's nice to think that if you go out and add a number one wide receiver, well, it's a foregone conclusion that you'll go beat the Chiefs next time. And I just don't think it's that simple, because I think the team is plenty good enough. It's just frankly a matter of getting the bounces to go the right way for you, and that's going to have more to do with continuing to get bites at the apple, this year and next year, 5 years into the future, as Josh Allen is firmly in his prime here. And it's hard to say with all the injuries that can happen to an NFL team when a breakthrough season is going to occur. And I think the Bills got a very firsthand lesson in that regard with the whole Von Miller experience. And I'm certainly not against adding veteran pieces at the right price or at the right time, but I just don't think that you're going to benefit in the NFL from going out and trying to force things when you're already even though Josh Allen has comparably a very reasonable contract and a good partnership with the Bills to work with those numbers, you're still paying him an awful lot of money against the cap. So it's not as if you've just got oodles of cash to spend and overspend on marginal free agents that were available. So they just bring in Josh Palmer on the offense, but I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue at the end of the day, because they were pretty darn good last year. And I'd say that the theme of the Bills, really since Joe Brady took over as the offensive coordinator, it's been what I call a four-wheel drive offense with Josh Allen, and it's definitely a different field than what the Ravens have going on down there with the Lamar Jackson and the Derrick Henry duo. But Josh Allen brings so much as a runner in addition to everything he's added as a passer, and he would be one of the best in the league if he was just working strictly from the pocket at this point in his career. But he's also just a weapon running the ball, and it just helps this backfield that's a really good group, and running behind an excellent offensive line, it just makes life easier for them. And so it's maybe not the offense we would have expected in the 2010s when so much was gearing towards the passing game, but we all know the pendulum has swung back in the NFL, and it's not as if Josh Allen is not productive as a passer. And as much as we talk about great quarterbacks being able to throw receivers open, make the best of those situations, and that's certainly true, you throw in the added component that a great run game is, it's not going to make life more difficult for pass catchers, right? If you have to commit somebody else to the run, you can't help as much on different routes. Like, it's marginal. It doesn't mean that, you can just throw the ball all over the yard because you run the ball well, right? But like, these things all help each other, and I think that the way that they continue to emphasize this four-wheel drive offense is just gonna continue to yield really good results up in Buffalo, and it's a perfect style of fit for the weather that they're gonna get up there in Northwest New York, I guess. Yeah. So I'm really happy to see James Cook re-signed with this team. Think that he's by far the most explosive element in the offense in terms of an individual skill player. Talk potential room for improvement with Dalton Kincaid and Keon Coleman in a moment, but I think that Ray Davis and Ty Johnson are really good players too, and I to some degree in a different NFL maybe I would understand going forward with those two to free up the cap space that you're spending on James Cook to maybe get a wide receiver in free agency if that were an available path. But like if you're gonna spend that money in free agency, like you're gonna get like a Josh Palmer who's not exactly moving the needle for me personally. So it's just not as easy as swapping out one position for the other without giving up a lot of value on the trade market. So I'm not thinking that obviously everybody wants to have good players at premium positions, but I don't think that you should be throwing great players at non-premium positions out the door just because it might prefer to have somebody at another premium position, because it just doesn't work that way, right? So I think that having James Cook there is awesome, and he just adds a whole different degree of juice to this offense. And I think he's got really good contact balance, and as a result runs better between the tackles than you might, expect, just because, so many of his highlights are him out in space and, when he can turn on the afterburners. But I think that it's a, big plus getting him back in the mix. In terms of the players around that could improve, Josh Palmer, he adds a certain element to the offense. He can run routes, but, I think he's ultimately just a complementary piece. I wouldn't call him a 1 or a 2 or anybody who's really going to, be worthy of drawing a notable target share or being a focus of the offense. Really like what Khalil Shakir brings to them in the slot, and expect him to continue to be a key part of this offense. And the X factor to me really comes down to Keon Coleman, who, and especially, even watching back their late season film, and this was, an opinion throughout the season, but just kind of gets re-emphasized looking at some of that. He just needs to move better out there at the end of the day. I think it's going to be really difficult unless you're getting more separation than Coleman was getting to really be a productive receiver in the NFL. He just is a guy who, like, it feels like the defender is just constantly glued to him, and he does some cool things at the catch point. And there were moments early in the season where he did some things after the catch that were maybe encouraging for where his route running could go if you saw a little more of, like, what I felt like was the juice we saw after the catch, like in the course of his routes. And again, it's not like this guy's some terrible athlete who's running a 5.4 out there and there's no hope for him. He just needs to get given all the other attributes he brings, and his game is going to be based on physicality and size. If he can get 10%, 15 more percent explosive, and just figure out some ways to generate a little more separation, I think it's going to make him a markedly more, useful receiver. And, I don't think that with his lack of real, running ability, I guess, to put it, as simply as possible, I don't see like a super high ceiling for Keon Coleman. But, could this guy be, a valuable player in this rotation who offers something different than everybody else that Buffalo has available as a pass catcher? I think that that could absolutely play out that way, and we'll just kind of see how that rolls through. Dalton Kincaid as another piece. I'm just really skeptical. Just based in, I know last year he was dealing with injuries, but I was, felt this way about him as a rookie. I just have never seen any tape in the NFL that indicates he has the type of high-level movement traits that you would need to really get what they hope to get out of him as a first-round pick in this player profile, right? Where it's an undersized tight end. He is not strong enough to block at the point of attack, so he just doesn't really even get counted as a tight end by the opponent, and they don't really need to in terms of, counting him in the run game or thinking that he's, a markedly different player as a run blocker than, any generic receiver that you could throw in there would be like, you could probably make the argument that you'd rather have Juwan Jennings blocking than Dalton Kincaid. So just as a comparison point, and then it's not as if he's some yak monster after the catch or anything. So I think Kincaid has really good hands, and he brings that to the table. I think he can be part of an offense as a complementary piece. But again, while I think he has a role in the NFL and I expect him to play for a long time, I don't see any circumstances where he's going to be a focal point of an offense, really drawing like, an 18-20+% target share and really being a player that you can feel like you're driving your offense through. So, I think for the time being, you've got Shakir as a chain mover, and I look at, Cook as a really explosive player for this offense. But beyond that, you're really counting on Josh Allen and what he can do behind this outstanding offensive line, which, is just such a fun group to watch. Like Spencer Brown and Deion Dawkins are just, they're fun players to watch, in addition to being like, very, very good, if not elite players at the position. Certainly, I think either one of them is a top. I haven't, made a list, but, would guess both of them would be in that 5 to 10 range if I were to rank the tackles on either side of the ball in terms of all the left tackles, all the right tackles, and then on the interior, just that group, really enjoyed what Connor McGovern brought to the table, kicking over to center. And then, I would say that on that interior, it's more the sum of the parts, where I think that Edwards and David Edwards and Connor McGovern and then Osiris Torrance, I don't know that I would, circle any one of them and say, oh yeah, like this dude should be in all-pro consideration, but like what they bring as a group, with a lot of size on the interior, and then also having the benefit of all having been healthy, so communication is typically quite good for Buffalo. Not a unit that you worry about just botching things up front on a regular basis. So I think that unit is really kind of in many ways the strength of this offense. Similar to kind of the setup that they had in Kansas City. It was flipped inside out when Joe Thuney was still there, and you had Creed Humphrey and Trey Smith, as just, in that case, elite players at their positions, and able to really, really be the kind of the heartbeat of the offense. I think that Buffalo brings that same thing to the table. So, hopefully for watching sake, everybody's healthy again this year. I think it's a really fun group to watch. Obviously, they got Alec Anderson, who jumps in there as the sixth offensive lineman on a regular basis. Really nice package for them. But at the same time, if Alec Anderson has to be playing tackle or guard at any point, I think that is a much dicier proposition, to say the least. So, the defense, feel like they're going to be solid enough in Buffalo, but man, I'm like, I'm more optimistic along the front in terms of what they might get out of that mix of players, and I think that they're seen just a couple nice flashes from T.J. Sanders and Deion Walker, not consistent dominance by any means, but good moments, so reason for optimism there. But like I look at the back end of this defense, and Maxwell Hairston is still sidelined at this point in camp, so if he's not able to contribute to this secondary, I look at a group where I really like Christian Benford, really like Teron Johnson, but the group of Tre'Davious White at one outside spot, and then the safeties Cole Bishop and Taylor Rapp, I feel like that's like some outstanding group that's really going to lock down the back end. So we'll see what we get from the front, but I think they'd have to be outstanding. This is more a group where like I think that they've got maybe chance to be above average in the front, and have not they don't have a total dearth of talent in the back end, so they're more equipped than some teams we've talked about in the series. But at the end of the day, I think the mix is just, you wind up somewhere in that huge pack that I've talked about on other episodes, from probably defense 5 to defense 24, 25, where it depends on the opponent, and ultimately it's an average group that is going to have its results dictated by the opposing quarterback much more than they are going to dictate the terms of the game on their own. I think it's pretty rare to see that in the modern NFL. So they should be good enough. See the Bills, winning this division again, winning a lot of games. So we'll see where it all goes. But not many concerns with Buffalo, and it's just a team like the Chiefs at this point, where it's just interesting to see what the next iteration is, because there's no reason to expect that we won't have 5 to 10 more really good years of football from just an elite quarterback with all sorts of tools. So it's just about having the stars align one of these years for them. So, the Miami Dolphins, they were really hoping that the stars would align for them 2 years ago now, to max out Tua's rookie deal and continue to deal with the fallout. So it just noted that the first thing, Matt Judon was added to signed in it just I think 2 days ago or something like that. And there's a lot of situations where I would have thought that's a positive thing, and Matt Judon is still a guy who can play a role and be in a rotation for an NFL team. But I think that in the case of the Miami Dolphins, it's just brought to mind a lot of questions about a position group I've already got questions about, because I don't really understand where Matt Judon fits on this roster if Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips are both healthy right now. And putting together a healthy camp that they feel like they're going to get the best versions of those players this season. Because if that is the case, then you've got those two, and then Chop Robinson, who, if they're active on game day, I don't think any of those three are really going to be playing a role on special teams. And I would be highly surprised to see a team dress a fourth edge rusher and in Matt Judon, who's just going to be a pure pass rush specialist, when you've already got this big investment in those three players to bring the pass rush. So I don't know exactly what that means, and maybe it means nothing and everything's fine, and I'm just going to be proven very wrong in that case about the Dolphins' prospects for this upcoming season. Because if Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips are the players that they can be, I would have a decidedly more optimistic outlook about this situation down in Miami than I do. But, those guys just have been hurt, and you have to deal with the reality of what that often means in the NFL, unfortunately. Because this is, in the best case scenario, a really fun defense. I think the quarterbacks are, still very, very much a question across the board. And if the pass rush doesn't come together, that could be just a full blown disaster, depending on how things develop. But hey, if he ought to, I don't know, butchering his first name, but Melifonwu is healthier than he's been in Detroit. He was a blast to watch as a player in the box. You can do a lot with him, incorporate him in blitzes, stuff like that. He's a really fun player, and then he pairs really well with Minka Fitzpatrick, who's can sit back and play center field all day if you want him to, and that pairs great. And then they can mix things up as they need to. They could play some three safety looks with Ashton Davis, who was slated to start until a few weeks ago, as well, to sort of mitigate some of the issues they have at outside cornerback. And talk about the Green Bay Packers on a future episode, but the Packers are another team that might be in that same boat. So I don't think that's a deal breaker, but I just wonder. Obviously that's been a theme as I talk about the Dolphins, but obviously don't question how good those players are when they're right, but that that didn't do them any good last year because neither one of them could play. So we'll see how it all works out. In terms of players who are out there right now and coming along on the line, I thought that looking at Jonah Savinia, I gotta listen to somebody else pronounce that one too. Geez, I'm butchering a lot of these names on this show. But in any case, I think that he certainly brings a lot of size. That's positive to see him out there. At the same time, I think that's mitigated a little bit by the fact that Austin Jackson is hurt again. He's on track to be back for the season, but it just doesn't bode well for a guy who has missed this much time to date in his career. And I think that I don't think Austin Jackson is a great player by any means. I think he's about average if that, but he's a solid starter who, if he's healthy, should be filling one of the starting slots in the NFL. And if he's not available, then obviously you are dropping down a couple of rungs there. So we'll see. But just another injury for him in a career full of them. So disappointing for him, and hopefully at some point he can overcome these injuries. And I think it's still very much a wait and see situation. But more inclined to think that the offensive line is going to continue to be a rough point for the Dolphins. So we'll see. Hopefully, Tua and Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Devon Achane are all humming at full speed here. But at the same time, I think Tyreek is out with an oblique injury, so that's not ideal. Did activate Darren Waller off, physically unable to perform, it looks like, so maybe they get him ramped up for week 1, but I really question how much he's going to add to the offense. We'll have to see how it all sorts out. But got a lot of questions about the Dolphins with their situations at corner and just the issues they've had on the offensive line. And if you go back to my take on them in the spring, I just don't feel good about this roster overall, and think it is kind of a dire situation for Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel down there, which is just it's disappointing, because I loved watching this team so much, and not so much last year, but the 2 seasons before that, really. And the beginning of the season was just like Christmas Day in terms of what McDaniel was going to have incorporated into this offense as far as wrinkles and all the motion and this and that. And he is such a creative thinker and pushing some of the boundaries of the game, and really things that people are going to pick up across the league. But you can only out innovate for so long, and everybody's catching up to this stuff, and at some point you need the players and everything like that as well. We'll see. If it doesn't work out in Miami, I think still bright future in the league on offense for McDaniel, and obviously a young guy, so who knows what the future holds for him. But I think that at the end of the day, this is an incomplete roster, and they're not supposed to have an incomplete roster right now. They're supposed to be pushing for more, right? And that, again, going back to the comment I made about them pushing the chips all in for the end of, with all the trades for the veterans on Tua's rookie deal. It's like, that's all well and good if you are going to move on from that rookie quarterback at the end of the deal. But if you're not, then I don't really think that's a great way to go about things. I think that you should be a lot more concerned with answering the question of how you're going to continue to put together a competitive roster after you give the quarterback that contract. And the answer to that has to be continuing to draft and continuing to backload your roster with players who are going to be providing surplus value on their contracts, because they're still on their rookie deal when Tua signs his extension. Not trading for Jalen Ramsey and Bradley Chubb and Tyreek Hill, who are going to be playing on top of the market extensions already, and then are going to be asking for pay raises in addition to that. And then you've given up the lottery picks that you would have given you an opportunity to get some cost-controlled players. And, it's a fine method for a targeted year or something like that. But, they've just really gutted this roster, and it's, going to take, multiple years to restock it at this point in the draft. So, we'll see how this works out. But I think they've just, if you just look at the roster management and the roster construction, and you're just looking at deals that simply aren't valuable, or they're at market value, so they're not valuable assets. And then in the other column you've got anything that's providing some sort of surplus, and it is outside of Devon Achane, it is awful tough to find quality names to add to that list of players that is on a rookie deal and really looking to move the needle for this upcoming Miami Dolphins team, with players like, obviously Savania, yet to be determined. So see how it works out in Miami, but, obviously I'm not so high on them. The New York Jets, we got to see this translate to an overall product and how it all fits into the team construct. But just on a positive note for a team that hasn't had a lot of positives lately, I think that Armand Membu, Ola Fashanu, and Will McDonald are three players that have just kind of stuck out to me as looking really good physically on the preseason film early. We'll see where that all leads, but there's worse places to start than with bookend offensive tackles and a really a guy who looks like he might be a dominant edge rusher in Will McDonald. I actually did not like. He changes his number so much. He kind of get caught up in it. But I guess he has been rocking the current number for a year now. But watching him play against Zach Tom from the Packers in their first preseason game, it's just difficult to miss number 9. He is just physically dominant. He looks like he's just gotten bigger as he's been in the league. Didn't think of him as being like super undersized, looking at him on the hoof in that game, and he's just still got such great quickness. I mean, he can get across these offensive tackles faces so quickly. And I mean, Zach Tom is a guy who is he's not the biggest offensive tackle in the league at all. He's a guy who relies on footwork and quickness, and to see the way McDonald was crossing him up and everything was just like, whoa. Yeah, just one of those moments. That's always fun when you see a guy pop like that. So I think that those guys could all have really strong years. Again, I have no idea what that translates to for the Jets as a team, but just some up and coming names on a team that maybe doesn't have some of the established stars. Of course, they have still have some guys like the Williams brothers and then Sauce Gardner. So I guess that Garrett Wilson, so definitely some established players, but at the same time, some up and comers that are going to be fun to watch as well for the Jets here. Also just as a side note, good to see Justin Fields running great. So the foot injury scare, doesn't seem to have had any long-term effects here, which obviously a positive because this Jets season would be just a lot less interesting to watch if Justin Fields isn't playing quarterback, and that's not to say it's going to be great or it's going to be bad. I think that Fields continues to have a lot of potential, and obviously needs to get better at a lot of things as a passer. But he's an electric athlete, and he can definitely deliver the ball with accuracy when he knows where he is going with it. So I think that still in the cards that he can continue to build and progress as a quarterback in the NFL. We've got too many examples to count. It's getting to the point where outside of some of these elite superstars, every one of these guys who's a good player in the league has a development story, right? So, that of course doesn't guarantee that everybody is going to develop, but, that's just the reality of the NFL. And maybe it always has been, and I haven't, been watching, for long enough to really realize it. But I do feel that, there were more examples of guys that, didn't show the kind of progress that I've seen out of guys like Geno Smith and Sam Darnold's and Baker Mayfield's in just this recent window. So I think that it's going to be a fun year for the Jets with Aaron Glenn bringing a new feel to it. It's going to be fun to see what him and Steve Wilkes come together to do on defense, because Glenn has definitely emphasized that he is not looking to be the de facto defensive coordinator and just have a placeholder. He wants to be the head coach and allow his respective coordinators to run their units. So we'll have Tanner Engstrom getting his first shot, which as an OC, it'll be an interesting fit. He's been in Detroit. I think it's fair to say that Jared Goff's a very different quarterback than Justin Fields. So it'll be really fun to see how Engstrom looks to weaponize that. So that's same time. I think it's be a real surprise if the Jets do end up making a significant amount of noise in the win-loss column. I think they're going to be competitive, tough to play against every week. Probably hopefully they could certainly have more successful numbers than Detroit did in Dan Campbell's first year, but it could be a similar feel where they're not necessarily winning a ton of games, but just obviously building in the right direction, and I think that would be good for a squad that's looking to get young and figure out a long-term solution at quarterback. So it'll be fun to watch the Jets this year. Not super high expectations, but I think that's pretty reasonable for where they're at in their build. So getting into the fantasy notes, I would say first one off that is with what Devon Achane brings as a receiver in addition to his production as a runner. I think it's hard not to love this player at this point. I had a lot of questions, just given how fast he was, and felt smaller his rookie year, I guess, and maybe that's just because he did get banged up. But I just had questions about his durability. But he was able to be around for the bulk of the action last season, and with him bringing that to the table and the upside he brings, and then you talk about all those things. I mean, in terms of his route running, some of the routes he's running, I mean, you see him running post routes and stuff. So he's like, I don't know how good he would be if he was a full-time receiver, but like it seems like he would at least make an NFL roster and probably be in the rotation as a complimentary receiver. So, I think he brings a ton. Expect him to probably, be the third receiver for this team in terms of, we look at receptions, targets, yards, touchdowns at the end of the year. I would expect him to outpace, I don't think Darren Waller is going to come in and really replace A-Chan at this point in his career. Sorry. I always forget if it's A-Chain or A-Chan. I think it's the Chan, because the chain would have sounded so cool, but yeah, right. I would say that he's a surefire top 5 pick in the elite tier if he's in a different roster situation. Obviously we saw Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, throwing Josh Jacobs. I think I could certainly keep going as guys that you switch situations, and obviously is going to impact things for you as a running back. But I think that under the current circumstances, he's going at that 1-2 turn. He's a pick I'm just excited about. You're talking about a back who's going into his 3rd year. This should be his prime, as healthy as he has been. And despite the fact that I'm not incredibly high on the Dolphins, there's no question the offense can be clicking and be efficient and put up points and yards. Now, I don't know what that'll mean, in terms of like exactly how they can move the ball, how it'll look late in the season, those sorts of things. But in terms of the fantasy year, I think that A-Chan is going to be, a really good player this season, and certainly a name that I am more than happy to add to my roster around that 1-2 turn. Just depending on the build I end up pursuing there. So, so I'm much more indifferent on Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. I think they're, Tyreek, maybe, I'm a little bit lower on him than I think his ADP is right now. I worry about the injuries. Just worry about where he's at this point in his career. Obviously, down year last year for a variety of reasons. He's getting older. I believe there were, there were concerns about him in Kansas City. Even when they traded him, they felt that, even if he was, at the peak of his power, or still pretty close to the peak of his powers, that there were reasons to expect a decline in the years to come, and they probably wouldn't have the same Tyreek Hill for year after year. And I think that he probably exceeded those expectations. For those first couple of years in Miami, it's hard to argue with that given what the numbers were. But at the same time, going to slow down eventually, and he is, he's not a big player. So if he is not at full strength and full speed, Tyreek's not a guy who's gonna make a living kicking into the slot and bodying guys out as like Larry Fitzgerald style or something like that, I guess I would say. So you'll see where he's at, but not really a guy I'm targeting. Tua, the lack of rushing in fantasy makes him difficult to be a factor in any redraft 1 quarterback league. Obviously, if you're playing super flex, then that brings a lot of quarterbacks into the mix, and I do think that Tua can definitely be productive if he's out there on the field throwing the ball. So moving along, I had been worried about James Cook from Buffalo's draft position just because of the contract, but now that he signed the contract, I think that he's going right about the right spot. I think that likely to see a decline in touchdowns after a extremely prolific season on that front. But as I said earlier, I think that this is the most explosive player on Buffalo's offense, and while I don't expect him to get a huge carry share a la a Saquon Barkley or a Derrick Henry, I do expect him to be super explosive with the touches he does get, and he's playing in a really good offense. You expect them to score a lot of points, so a lot of reasons to feel positive about James Cook, and think that he's going to wind up being a quality back that you can slot in as a starter once again this year. I'm not so big on the upside of either Dalton Kincaid or Keon Coleman, despite the quarterback they play with. I think there's just too deep of a room here, and I just don't know that either one of them is going to just do enough to really justify a huge increase in target share. If I were to bet on one player, it would be Coleman, given that he's just got a shorter track record. He's had an offseason to work based on what he learned his rookie year, so we'll see how that looks. Clicking over to the Patriots, Stephon Diggs is a player and realized I just skipped over the New England Patriots entirely. So hang on, I'll let me finish up these fantasy things. Whatever, I'm going to do the show and in one recording scrolled down too fast there, but I can get back and hit the New England Patriots as a team. So sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, so Stephon Diggs is a player I really like taking a shot on. Looks to be moving around well after the knee. Things are never guaranteed, but guy has every shot to be a number one receiver with a really talented quarterback. Also like dice rolls on Travion Henderson and Kyle Williams. I think everybody likes the dice roll on Travion Henderson at this point. And, I think that Drake May is a really interesting pick because if you were to pick, in my opinion, one quarterback out of the glut of guys that's available after the big four in Jaden Daniels, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and then, I'd say after, Burrow's kind of the consensus 5. In that whole group that I think you could put together like 6 to, 18 there. I think there's a lot of debate. I think Drake May's the one who has the upside to be the quarterback 1 because he brings so much as a runner and he's, has the potential to pick up rushing touchdowns. He's got that great size, get into him a little more with the Patriots, but I do think that gives him unbelievable upside as a fantasy quarterback. We'll have to see it translate to the field, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be quite optimistic about the ceiling on Drake May. Not super into anyone on the Jets from a fantasy perspective. Justin Fields is an interesting quarterback option with his running ability. I'm lower than consensus on Garrett Wilson just because I think there's a chance that this is such a run-heavy offense. There's just not a ton of opportunities, even though I do have Garrett Wilson at about double the targets of the second guy on the Jets in Mason Taylor, who slots on there as my second guy. And then, right now, Breece Hall's in competition, and I had him third in targets. I really don't know where the targets are going behind those guys. But at the same time, despite the lack of competition, I think that profile looks really different in terms of the potential upside for Garrett Wilson in an offense where Justin Fields is the quarterback versus Aaron Rodgers. And, we'll see. The DJ Moore did have a very productive season with Justin Fields at quarterback, so it's not out of the question, but it's just not a bet I'm trying to make. So so those are the fantasy notes, and again, got this out of order, so hopefully anybody who takes the time to listen to this can live with that. But yes, circling back to the New England Patriots and how they look, I think the Patriots, a lot of reason for optimism right now. I think Stephon Diggs out there looking good. That feels critical to having a real presence in the wide receiver room because they didn't have anybody who could uncover last year against man coverage. It was just really rough to watch at times. Kept hoping that Kayshon Boutte, given the amount of snaps he was getting, would break out and show a little bit more, but he just doesn't appear to move quite well enough to really separate at the NFL level, and it makes things tough. So Stephon Diggs has always been able to do that when healthy, and he could really change this offense. So I think on the rookie front, Will Campbell just, I'm really excited to see him in regular season action, but, a lot of reason to be optimistic about him after the preseason. You definitely see the narrow frame relative to some other offensive linemen along the Patriots line through the shoulders and everything, but that's not the basis of his game. His game is clearly about his feet and his movement ability and his quickness that stands out really from the jump on his tape. He's been ultra aggressive in the preseason. Obviously wants to get out there, bring a certain attitude to play ball, which you love. We'll see how that translates into the regular season games, but I think that in Will Campbell's case, if you've got a guy who has those deficiencies in the ideal measurables, the question is, well, what do you do to make up for that? What's different about your game that would allow you to thrive without those measurables when a lot of other guys haven't? In Will Campbell's case, I thought it was very clearly his feet and his movement ability, right off the get-go. So we'll see how it looks. So get into the regular season. Jared Wilson, got to see him in the first week. I don't believe that he was out there with the starters in the second week, or noted his absence actually, because it was Ben Brown out there at left guard next to Campbell in the second game, unless I'm hallucinating here. But I did like the way Jared Wilson was moving around. Definitely looks like a powerful guy. One of those things where he didn't strike me as a center only either, which is something I heard in the draft run up. Just looking at him move in that first preseason game, I didn't see a reason he couldn't play guard. And his measurements are 6'3", 310. See why he would be restricted to playing center. given what I saw. So, that opens up some different options for them as they sort out who will be the starters on that at that left guard and center position here. Beyond that, so with those component parts in place, I think it all is going to come down to Drake May. Certainly running a little hot in the last preseason game in terms of this was a problem with May in terms of sprays last year as a rookie, and I guess you could say that about a couple of the throws. Now I'm thinking back on them, some of them are catchable balls, but they're just high and hot, and right on the verge of going completely over guys' heads in a couple of spots. And that's obviously not 100% of the throws. We're just talking about a couple, but you just feel like he's just a little too juiced up, and I just really hope he can get that dialed in, because if he does, and the ceiling on Drake May is just spectacular. And, if it doesn't happen this year, I think there's a very good chance, I'm not going to, be out on Drake May, because you can see, what it could look like if it all comes together and he just, gets that little bit more accurate. It's not that he doesn't have, a lot of good moments as a passer, which gives you reason to believe that he could get more consistent with that accuracy, because, hey, we've seen that from plenty of quarterbacks in NFL history in terms of, amping up that accuracy just a little bit. So we will see what it looks like there. Haven't mentioned Travion Henderson, of course, did in the fantasy notes, but really excited for what he brings to the offense. You talk about a group that didn't have juice last year. I think that it's clear from the preseason that this guy has juice to burn. So, I think that he's going to be a great component to this offense. Really fun seeing how it looks like this is coming together. And then, defensively, a lot of good parts. So, I think it, I've heard people question if maybe the defense is a year ahead of arrival date. But you know what? If Diggs is playing the way that you hope he can, and the rookies emerge, if Kyle Williams, who looks like he's going to move around and be able to move around and provide a lot more wiggle on his routes than some of the guys last year, if those guys hit and Drake May's, ready to cook, then this thing's ready to go. And I think they're pot committed to Drake May either way. They're gonna ride this out. That's why a big part of why Vrabel's here. So, I think that, hey, maybe it does turn out to be a little bit aggressive, but there's also a chance that the Patriots are, making the playoffs here this season, and with the ceiling on Drake May and what the defense could bring, it's very possible that this team could make some noise this year. I don't think necessarily thought you'd be saying that a year ago, just because it was disappointing in so many ways. But there's a lot of promise here, and obviously nothing guaranteed with the outcome they had last year. But I think that I can see definitely the upside case for this team. I think they're at least going to be right in the middle of the pack. So looking at that defense, I mean, Milton Williams is a player I really like. I thought that there's only so many guys who really get penetration and really impact the game, and I would rather get those guys in the building when I can, and try to fill in some of the more role positions or smaller complementary roles on the defensive line with down the line additions. And if you're finding run stuffers as undrafted guys because you're spending the extra money to get Milton Williams as opposed to what Carolina got on the other side of getting outbid, I'll take the Milton Williams bet any day. I think that it's really interesting to think about, if Carlton Davis is healthy, if Christian Gonzalez is healthy the whole year. I mean, one of the better corner duos in the NFL, just, hands down. And, we'll see what they get up front. I think Keon White, had some really promising moments last year. Just, great, versatile player, as a really big-bodied, long defensive lineman. And, we'll see what he can do in terms of taking a step. And if Christian Barmore's back healthy, again, I guess I would say that, in the best case scenario, and there is a lack of edge rush here that makes it a little bit difficult. This is a unit that, if Milton Williams is at his best, if Keon White takes a step forward, this is a unit that might be able to flirt with that top five or get into that top five and really be one of those defenses that can make themselves felt, because, with that corner duo, if you can lock down on the outside, it gives you so much flexibility in how you structure the middle of the field defense. And, when you can do that and you've got a number of good players in place to work with on that, I think that it makes life way easier on defense, and it opens up a lot of possibilities. So, I think that, Patriots to me are an easier team to get juiced up about than, and obviously I had been planning to do the Jets last, and I'd say comparing it, I could see, the Jets getting back to the level they have been on defense as well. And if Fields were to really exceed expectations, then I could see him juicing up their offense as well. But I would just say that, I see a little bit cleaner path, I guess, for the Patriots to kind of take it on the rise here. So skipping back down to the win totals, so I'm not too high on the Patriots relative to the market here at the end of the day when everything all shakes itself out. But I just want to note those differences. But so for the win totals, got Buffalo at 11.53 expected wins in my composite schedule, where everybody faces all 31 teams home and away. I have them at 11.29. They've got a plus 0.24 differential there, which is have that. That's 15th in the league. I think I wrote down 16th, but I think that's the Rams. So Vegas has them at 11.5/12.5 wins. So I'm more or less in line with them. 12.5 is a big win total in the NFL. So a little lower on that, but wouldn't really be looking to bet against the Bills here with the consistency they've had. I've got Miami at 7.21 expected wins. They have a 6.84 comp plus 0.37 win differential, which makes their schedule the 11th most difficult in the league. All four of these teams have favorable schedules, in the upper half of the league in terms of difficulty, and all positive relative to if they were playing a composite schedule. Vegas has got Miami at 7.5 wins. That is an under I would probably play. I definitely see the upside with the tools they have on offense, and then if the defense is healthy. But I'm willing to bet against that defense being healthy, just given the history of Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb. It's just tough for guys who have suffered multiple significant lower body injuries to find the fountain of youth in the NFL, and obviously like both players, and hopefully for them personally, all works out, but just not something I'm betting on. The Patriots I've got at 8.33 expected wins. They have a 7.54 comp. That plus 0.79 diff is second in the NFL to San Francisco. New England gets some really unique advantages relative to the rest of the division because they have the fourth place schedule, and that happens to line up with the Saints and the Browns, who are the two lowest ranked teams in my rankings by a considerable margin. So that helps to explain that, where they're 10 spots higher than the other teams in their division. So they're at 8.5 wins with Vegas. 8.33. I wouldn't bet the under at all. Wouldn't really see a reason to bet the over either. Again, last podcast talked about there's not huge edges on these win totals, and it ties up your money for so long. I feel like I can find as many edges on the win totals for the season every week in spreads and totals, and that money gets turned in a few hours, or a week tops if you're betting out in front. So I'd rather do that, but I would probably play the over if I were playing anything on New England, have them pretty tight to Vegas. And then the Jets I have at 6.85 expected wins, 6.51 in the composite schedule, so plus 0.34 win differential there. Vegas has them at 5.5 or 6.5, so I'm kind of right in there with it. And again, a lot of reason for excitement in this division. I think New England and the Jets are both on the upswing, and Buffalo is just continuing to churn things out. And I hope that Miami gets their best case scenario, because they're a really fun team, and if they don't, we might see a breakup of that whole build down in Miami. But it's certainly been a fun run if you look at the 3 years in their totality. So hopefully they can get things back on track in this year and buck that trend that we saw last year. So that's it for the AFC East. I'll be continuing on with these division previews. Have 4 left to go, and then we'll be starting to get closer and closer to football season and get to talk about some live film rather than just watching a little bit of preseason and talking about some outdated stuff. So hope everyone's enjoying their summer, and if you get a chance to like or subscribe, certainly appreciate it. So have a good one.